Alright guys, how's it going? So I took last week off, kind of. What I really did was mope around, struggling to come up with a video that I actually wanted to produce. So really, in that week off, I failed to write multiple scripts before finally giving in to the fact that the only writing I'd achieve would be writing the whole week off. I've talked about this in the past, maybe more on some Patreon videos, but I am driven by certain motivational factors, and quite a few of them have taken a serious beating over the last month. It's affecting the channel and will have to be dealt with somehow. There will be big changes coming regarding the channel content. And to be frank, the lack of motivation simply accelerated, and I was ready to write off another week. Until finally, this Wednesday morning, Intel came to the rescue in a way only they could do. An internal news piece on their company intranet, Circuit, was shared by a user named SCV Good to Go over at Reddit, and here it is in full. As you can see, it is pretty long, and Tech Power Up were fastest to stick it up on their site. So let's get started with this bizarre article meant for Intel employee eyes only. AMD's competitive profile, where we go toe-to-toe, why they are resurgent, which chips of ours beat theirs. Although over the last 5 decades, Intel has grown to more than 10 times the size of AMD, $70.1 billion versus $6.48 billion in the most recently reported annual revenues, the two companies are now competing fiercely across several market segments. By most accounts, the competitive threat to Intel from AMD is the greatest it has been in years. And the introduction ends with, following AMD's recent product announcements at Computex and the E3 gaming conference, this profile, the latest in a Circuit News series on Intel's major competitors such as TSMC, examines AMD and the challenges that company is posing to some of our businesses. It's interesting to see Intel talk about TSMC as a competitor, as TSMC have fabbed chips for Intel in the past, or have they? What happened to that whole chipset rumour back in the last quarter of 2018? I can't remember hearing much about it afterwards, just that obviously Intel, who were struggling with a shortage of capacity, were supposedly getting TSMC to manufacture some chipsets. I can't find anything concrete on that, but regardless, Intel and TSMC, competitors, not partners. Only the paranoid survive, Intel. But looking back at the first part I highlighted here, Intel at 10 times the size of AMD, by their own words, under fierce competition from their much smaller x86 competitors. Then we get this infographic which doesn't really tell us a whole lot, in all honesty. Before moving on to the reasons why, according to Intel's competitive expert, Steve Collins, AMD is now a formidable competitor. And straight off the bat we discover that Intel not only has a competitive expert, but a team of experts on performance, power, and competitive analysis. And their analysis was summarised as, AMD offers high-performance CPUs, posing direct competition to Intel in both our core client and data center CPU businesses. With our announced ambitions to bring new discrete graphics to market, we are bringing new competition to both AMD's and Nvidia's graphics businesses. This second sentence is completely superfluous there. This one is telling though. AMD has recently been gaining some traction in winning public cloud offerings, and competition from AMD is shaping up to be especially tough in high-performance computing. HPC performance is usually driven by the number of cores and the number of memory channels, or memory bandwidth. Intel is challenged on both fronts. Now, we've already seen some pretty major wins for AMD in HPC, and Rome still hasn't even launched. There's the HLRS Hawk, announced back in November. We heard recently about Frontier, although that appears to be Milan, which is the follow-up to Rome. And another recently was Sigma 2. If a supercomputer is being planned or built right now, there's a really good chance it's being built with AMD inside. Next up was pretty interesting. AMD's upcoming next-generation Zen core products, codenamed Rome for servers and Matisse for desktop, will intensify our desktop and especially server competition. The latter is likely to be the most intense in about a decade. Most intense in about a decade. I'm thinking back to 2009 and onward, and AMD never really had any kind of server presence during the last 10 years. In 2009, they'd just about be getting over the disastrous Barcelona chips, and the follow-up Shanghais, they weren't really anything to write home about either. They did, however, release a surprisingly good chip in Core, which had many cores and pretty decent clock speeds, but none of them gained any real traction. Here's a slide in fact. I mean, sure, back in 2004, 2005, that was competition, but you can see since then, it has just been a long, slow slide to triviality. But moving on, it's interesting to see that Intel feels that they are still in the fight on the desktop. I've been saying this for months. They're getting thrashed in servers, especially in performance per watt. But they can still remain relevant on the desktop. I'll get to that point soon. Outside of desktop and servers, Intel's competitive position in notebooks and business PCs is stronger as customers value specific aspects such as productivity performance, battery life, and overall manageability, where Intel has clear advantages versus the competition. This is really more about Intel having the laptop ecosystem behind them, and AMD doesn't really fight them there. Seemingly content to be resigned to the bargain basement price segments, Intel puts a lot of money into laptop design, and they throw a lot of money around it as well. All this stuff about performance, battery life, whatever overall manageability means, it's just not true, and AMD's latest laptops are on par on CPU performance, while being miles ahead on GPU. But still, Intel doesn't need to be afraid of anything in this space, because AMD doesn't really try hard enough. The last bit of competitive analysis talks about TSMC's 7nm being a driver, but that Intel were back with their own 10nm Ice Lake parts, which garnered strongly positive reviews at Computex. But it wasn't long before the discussion got serious, with Steve quickly going on to say, "We will be facing tough competitive challenges." There were a few key points on how Intel's products compare to AMD's. These will be points that Intel underscores in the challenging period ahead. Challenging again. I've been reading that word a lot in this article. But essentially, we see Intel's expectation that their 9th gen CPUs are still likely to lead Ryzen on lightly threaded productivity benchmarks, as well as many gaming benchmarks. No doubt helped by the 9900KS and its 5GHz all-core turbo. But Steve does go on to admit that for multi-threaded workloads, such as heavy content creation workloads, Ryzen is expected to lead. However, here's where it gets interesting, and we see that Intel doesn't like Cinebench. Again, this one has been a recurring point over the past couple of months, with Cinebench especially getting Intel's ire, due to it representing one of the best case benchmarks for AMD, while Intel believes that Cinebench is not a representative benchmark for general platform evaluations and real-life workloads. I, however, was reminded of the Broadwell E-release when Intel provided me with their reviewer's guide, which recommended Cinebench as a benchmark. Of course, when your competition is nowhere to be seen on that benchmark, remember Ryzen hadn't launched yet, then I guess it's a fine line between unrepresentative and recommended. But that paragraph continued, curiously, with Intel continues to work with press on using real applications for evaluating performance to produce PCs such as this one from PC Perspective. Now, I don't have access to Intel's corporate intranet, sadly, so I can't click on this link. But it was easy to ascertain which PC Perspective article was being discussed. Just about a month ago, before Computex, and Intel discusses real-world performance focus while teasing Gen 11 graphics and the 9900KS. Hosted by John Carville, Intel's VP of Tech Market Leadership, and Ryan Shrout, Intel's Chief Performance Strategist. Good old Ryan, with a star after his name. Now, obviously, when you see this, it means there's a footnote. Let's just see what the footnote says. Ryan Shrout is founder and former editor-in-chief of PC Perspective. He no longer has any editorial or financial relationship with the site. But was this article paid for by Intel? Their wording at least appears to suggest it is. However, I don't see any disclaimers on the PC Perspective article, so I guess not. Let's take a look at what Intel's performance for the real world entails. Intel used the event to expand its argument for making performance measurements based on more real-world workloads and tasks. The gist of this was hardware reviewers, analysts, and even hardware manufacturers themselves often measure and make important decisions or recommendations based on testing methods that don't actually reflect modern workloads or needs. And to illustrate the gap between benchmarking and reality, Intel provided this table. Now, I always say look closely at tables and charts and endnotes because chances are you'll miss something really important if you don't. At the bottom of this, we discover the existence of Intel's Product Improvement Program for the second quarter of 2019. This quarter, okay, where 1.85 million systems, all of them desktop PCs, with 8 cores or less, but with discrete graphics what were they part of exactly? Let's see. Over at the Intel Computing Improvement Program, Intel wants to empower you by providing the best computer experience. This program uses information about your computer's performance to make product improvements that may benefit you in future. Simply download below and accept consent. We'll do the rest. Intel uses all reasonable efforts to safeguard your data. So I guess by that they mean all your data is being held on servers running AMD hardware. I'm just winding you up, Intel. So presumably people can opt into this. I find it really hard to believe that nearly 2 million people have done this deliberately, and definitely not people who would be considered tech savvy. And would you believe it, but my first search for it turns up this post on the Intel subreddit, with the user saying they found an Intel telemetry service running on their PC. And they don't even remember entering this Intel Customer Experience Improvement Program. But getting back to the table, real world, not really. Intel claims that these near 2 million desktop users are mostly doing Office applications. We can see Excel, we can see Word, PowerPoint, no great surprises there. Now looking at gaming though, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Overwatch, Grand Theft Auto 5. All these games really tend to highly favour Intel. And that does kind of make me think that this list here could be cherry-picked. It's not a wholly inclusive list. We can see that there are clear gaps. But looking at the current top Steam games, you do have Counter-Strike there. You've got Grand Theft Auto 5. Obviously Overwatch is on Battle.net instead. So this Intel list actually looks to be fairly legitimate, though for some reason they haven't included Dota 2 and PUBG. And those are certainly played more than Overwatch and Grand Theft Auto 5, I would wager. But overall, even if Intel have chosen to display the best games for their architecture here, it's hard to disagree with their findings. What Intel calls light content creation. I'm not sure I'd agree 100% with that. Premiere is in there. Rendering videos is of course extremely intensive. But I guess the rest of them, yeah, you could call that light content creation. Game streaming with OBS, that's there again. And right at the bottom, Intel has yet another go at Cinebench by showing that only around 0.5% of users, these users at least, use Cinema 4D, which is the application that Cinebench benchmarks. A lot of people think that Cinebench is a synthetic, but it's not. It actually benchmarks Cinema 4D. Intel's issue here is 0.5% of users using Cinema 4D, and yet they claim that 80% of the tech press use the Cinebench benchmark in their reviews, PC Perspective included in that. Now, to PC Perspective's credit, they're not fully buying into Intel's argument, going on to say, Intel's argument is valid to a degree. From a consumer standpoint, the more that benchmarks reflect their intended usage, the better. And I can't disagree with that, although I would like to see the entire details of this product improvement program, as there's just a little bit too much missing information for me to declare it home and dry. However, PC Perspective continue with, a valid counter-argument is that the class of consumers most interested in detailed PC hardware reviews would have more demanding needs, 3D rendering, ray tracing, etc., than the average consumer presumably captured by Intel's data. And this is something that I would also agree with, especially as people who have a bit more tech savvy would be unlikely to opt into this kind of telemetry, or would be more inclined to deny it if it were being foisted upon them during a system install or an update. But overall, I wouldn't strongly disagree with much of this table, even if it's been cherry-picked to a slight degree. PC Perspective end this part of the article with, in short, a theoretical shift to benchmarks that more accurately reflect common workloads is a good thing, but we're still going to use Cinebench. In times past, I would have looked upon all this with extreme suspicion. I would have gone through a bunch of tech sites before and after the Ryzen 3000 launch, seeing which ones changed their benchmarks to give Intel a leg up. I would have done that, but the fact is AMD isn't paying me to do that job, so I won't be. AMD also clearly don't have any competitive analysts like Shrout here. This whole thing bears his hallmark, and we at least now know what a chief performance strategist job at Intel entails. A few weeks later, and we discover that Intel has a gaming version of their performance for the real world as well, imaginatively titled Gaming Performance for the Real World, challenging AMD and its upcoming Ryzen 3000 processors to come beat us in real-world gaming. And look, we saw all of this coming a mile away, months ago. AMD did what? But getting back to circuit news, and this is where it all seems a little bit contrived, with Intel first of all admitting that they'll be challenged, again, on throughput-oriented benchmarks that scale well with core count, which would be the vast majority of server loads. However, Intel reckons Xeon is still expected to have cache and memory latency advantages. For this reason, Intel still expects Xeon to be competitive on applications that require fast response times and are sensitive to memory latencies. For example, database, analytics, web serving, and so on. I'm just going to point something out here about the wording. In fact, I'll go over to Tech Power Up, who have the entire article written out so it can be searched for the word disadvantage none. 0 hits. What about challenge then? 19 times. That word challenge whenever Intel has the disadvantage. And when Intel has the advantage? Well, take a look. 14 times. My original point though was this seems a bit contrived, with Intel picking on these light loads favouring them on desktop, but they're still concentrating on these same kind of Intel architecture favouring loads in server, without any mention of server usage patterns overwhelmingly favouring high core counts and bandwidth. I mean, stuff like this and this challenge advantage wording that they're using wherever applicable sure can go a long way to making an awful situation seem not quite so bad to the less enlightened reader. Believe it or not though, we are barely halfway through this, and Intel move on to talk about their secret sauce. Intel's secret sauce is not a single ingredient, rather it is these 6 pillars of innovation: process, architecture, memory, interconnect, security, and software that the company laid out at the last year's Intel Architecture Day. I had to record that around 10 times. Most of the time I broke down in a fit of laughter at process, and the times I got past that without buckling, the security innovation was just too much on top. But upon reading this whole section, it becomes apparent that they only really consider one of these 6 pillars, software, to be a win for them, suggesting that it has long been an unheralded Intel advantage. A key piece of Intel's competitive strategy is to highlight their software smarts vis-a-vis AMD. Intel designs software or software code contributions, which can touch everything from the Linux kernel to Adobe Lightroom. Everything except Cinebench, it seems, can capitalise on unique features in Intel architecture. But upon reading this section, it became apparent to me that Intel is in a staggering amount of trouble, and they know it. They mention 6 pillars of innovation: process, which they are losing in badly; architecture, losing badly; memory, winning some and losing some, you could say there; interconnect, losing badly; security. So yeah, they're apparently winning in software though. with their company's 15,000 software developers, that number being more than all of AMD's employees put together. Looking at the last two paragraphs here though, talking about platform advantages such as Optane memory, which is fair enough, but then also Wi-Fi, Thunderbolt, Turbo Boost 2.0. And this last paragraph here is especially bizarre, leaning on their Project Athena innovation program, which is basically throwing more money at OEMs in the one area, laptops, which AMD can't be bothered to compete with them in anyway. Next up, why AMD is resurgent and what Intel must do next. And he says that TSMC are a big factor, but he also recognised that AMD has improved again with Zen 2, noting that on workloads that are heavily threaded, including heavy content creation and most server workloads, they'll get great performance results. The next part was kind of mind-boggling though, when asked the difficult question that most clued up server guys are also asking: how do we respond when people say, wow, AMD is charging a lot less for their products than Intel? Steve's response was unfulfilling. First of all, claiming that people don't seem to understand that Intel offers cheaper products. I think people do understand that, it's just that your cheaper products continue to get blasted by faster, even cheaper AMD products, so this point is completely moot. And Steve then went on to claim that Intel's product pricing vis-a-vis AMD reflects the great deal of added value that specifically comes from buying Intel with our decades of unmatched investments in validation, software, and security. Security again. Is this an attempt to repeat a huge lie enough times that people start to believe in it? And then afterwards he claimed that some software is licensed per core, which means that the AMD solution has higher licensing costs, which would be fair enough, but VMware licenses per socket, not per core, and AMD has more cores per socket, so the reality here is the opposite is actually true. But to be fair, there was some admission also, with performance challenges absolutely exist. But Intel will continue to position their value and their advantages. Challenges and advantages, those two words again. And also, at times and on some workloads, we might dip below on performance, like the second half of this year. Towards the end, when asked how we should look at Intel versus AMD overall competitive right now, Steve again says, well, first, it's clearly a challenging time. We have significant competitive challenges to navigate, before candidly stating that we're in this position because of our execution issues, whether that's been related to our process technology node or to our products that intercept those nodes. Now more than ever, we need to lean into our sales and marketing teams to help carry us through these product challenges. Right, so there's been a lot of ire directed at Intel for this, and no doubt some of you are scratching your heads, just wondering what the point of it is. But we're all enthusiasts, and we're paying pretty close attention to what's going on in the PC and server worlds. Intel has 107,000 employees, and many, if not most of them, aren't anywhere near as savvy as what we are in these kind of matters. Just think about what might be going on around the corridors at Intel headquarters. Whispers of disastrous performance loss, all of these security vulnerabilities one after another. 10 nanometers, it is an ongoing shit show. There are tens of thousands of people who are hearing all this stuff constantly and maybe not fully understanding all the reasons behind it. Of course, there are tens of thousands of people at Intel who do know what's going on and the reasons behind it. And maybe those with less clue are the lucky ones. But regardless of that, this is simply an article. It's a mild propaganda piece which is supposed to help reduce some concerns that many at Intel may have. The wording has been carefully chosen at every point, as I pointed out, that whole challenge versus advantage thing. To us enthusiasts who can see through it though, it is clearly bad for Intel. And they're admitting to it in a roundabout way, which is what we find so amazing because we'd never really seen Intel do anything like this before. In the past, Intel simply ignored AMD's existence. The fact that they're no longer doing that, well, it does mean something. But again, to the people working at Intel who aren't as clued up as we are, these positives that they're bringing attention to will be reassuring in some fashion. I mean, what I mean is, We can look at Intel saying stuff like, but at least we're still good at Grand Theft Auto 5 and databases and web serving. We can see that it's basically an admission of a looming disaster. We know this because we know that Intel essentially owns around about 85% of the PC and 95% of the server markets. Only winning in about 50% of these loads would be a disaster. But the fact is they're scrambling hard to find any wins, and most of them are contrived. But there's also an element of education here. With so many people working at Intel, many of these normal people will be getting asked tough questions from press or even just friends and family. These things have got a way of spreading. So here we can see Intel trying to unify the message somewhat. And so now if somebody's asked, assuming that they've read this article at least, the answer is clearly, yes, we have some challenges ahead. AMD is resurgent, but Intel has our own unique advantages. Simple and effective. From a personal perspective, I'm happy to see Intel making any kind of admissions, and I think that Steve here had a really unenviable job on his hands to make the best out of it, because he clearly knows just how bad it is. And in a situation like this, you really can only look at your own strengths while trying to downplay your competition's. I can't fault Intel for doing that. I can't fault Intel for trying to manipulate the press into benching games and applications that favour their architecture. Especially not when they do have a valid point. AMD tried to do the same thing years ago with Bulldozer and their APUs. They went to war with Sysmark, releasing stupid videos talking about how some benchmarks were so unfair. The loser always cries unfair. That's just how it is. The fact here is, Intel knew they had a difficult time coming up, and they at least took some steps towards mitigating it. Ryan Shrout left PC Perspective on the 24th of October to become Intel's Chief Performance Strategist. Not even 10 minutes later, on my Patreon Discord, I said this. Chief Performance Strategist? One would think performance was performance and didn't need any strategy. Unless Intel would like to change how their performance is seen. And after Ryan left, half of the rest of the old PC Perspective joined him at Intel. Then they snapped up a bunch of tech press, including Kyle at HardOCP, who did leave again soon afterwards, Mark Walton of Ars Technica, and Damien Trioli, the Hardware France editor. It should have been reasonably apparent what the plan was here. Or maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist. But yeah, lo and behold, a month before Ryzen 3000 launches, we find Intel are pushing this whole real-life performance strategy onto the same tech press. I would have done the same thing had Intel offered me this job. What do you think AMD is doing to counter any of this? Nothing. They're doing nothing at all. And the tech press can lose the plot all they want this time. I am not gonna stop them. If you're an Intel employee watching this, you may be concerned about losing your job. I don't want you to lose your jobs because you're just normal people trying to do your jobs, but could be about to get screwed due to a legacy of disastrous Intel leadership. I would, however, try to ease your concerns just by pointing out AMD's complete lack of aggression. AMD have got the best CPU architecture by miles. They've got the most secure CPUs at much cheaper prices, at least in servers. And your own guy Steve basically spelled that out for you in this article. It should be an absolute massacre, but it won't be because AMD aren't aggressive enough. 5% market share is what they got to with Naples in 2 years. Naples versus Xeon is basically a tie, and yet AMD were only able to get 5% of the server market share. And now they're only targeting, around about double that over the next year and a half, with absolutely crushing performance per watt and performance per dollar. AMD will be content with less than 20% of the server market share over the next couple of years. They're giving you all the time you could possibly need to get back in the game. And all of the incoming Ryzen 3000 desktop chips, they are priced in a way to make high margins at not particularly high volumes. They'll be lucky to reach even their old average desktop share, which was around the 25 to 30% mark 10 years ago. with the Phenom 2. Now, think about that. Phenom 2 was okay, and AMD held nearly 30% of the desktop market with it. Right now they're around about 15% market share with Ryzen, and they will be lucky to hit 25% by this time next year, even with utterly dominant performance. They're afraid of awakening the old Intel beast, and they have zero intention of ever fighting any real market share battle with Intel again. And that's a message that you should have been told in this Circuit News article. Yes, AMD has the hardware advantage by far, but they need to have the intent behind it, which they just don't have. So wrapping this one up, I know I give Intel a hard time. To be honest with you though, most of it is just this kind of roasting, poking fun at their security issues and all that. But there's nothing here in this article that deserves any particular attention, other than the sheer surprise factor of them apparently owning up to the challenges that they have coming. But honestly, I don't expect it to be that bad. I just said why. AMD have got zero aggression. The idea that they're going to trounce Intel on market share is a joke, and Ryzen 3000 price points were chosen to avoid that. Intel, they'll lose a couple of $1 billion on the PC and server markets every year for the next couple of years. But they'll gain it elsewhere. And with a bit of luck, maybe they'll come in and mix up the graphics market. There's a couple of billions worth of Nvidia's money that I personally wouldn't mind see going Intel's way. I'll catch you later, guys.